You're live.
We are live.
Hello.
Great. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
Carrie.
Oh, hi, Sean. How are you?
Hi,
nice
everyone.
to
Yeah,
see you.
look at
And
us.
great, we're here at the Podcast Garage in Washington, D.C., which is such an exciting space. It's really a terrific day here, too. Very warm. So we should introduce ourselves. I'm Carrie Donahue. I'm the Director of Training for PRX. And
I'm Sean Rameswaram. I host a podcast called Today Explained for Vox, and I also host the Podcasting 101 videos, which hopefully you've already seen, but if not, you should see as soon as this is over.
yeah,
Fair?
Please watch all of them. There are 10 videos. They are part of the Google Podcast Creator Program. And we worked very hard on them, actually. The two of us, we have a lot of years of experience of training audio makers and now podcasters. And I've been making a little bit of a joke, though it's so true, that these videos, which are about 3 to 4 minutes long each, and cover a range of topics from sort of like how do you do your early stage idea and figure out who your audience is, you know, to actually making the thing, how to do interviews, how to structure your stories, and then all the way to getting an audience and finding your audience, reaching your audience, possibly monetization, which everyone would like to know. And then one that it's very dear to my heart, episode 10, which is about keep going, because we know that once you get started with this work, it can be, you know, like many creative projects, that you have to have some stick-to-itiveness to stay with it. So we worked very hard on those. It's kind of like the distillation of what we know about these things. And we're here today to talk more about them and to give you a chance to ask us some questions. I'm going to mostly Sean. You get to ask Sean questions about making podcasting. We are not going to probably have time for like really specific feedback on your individual podcast. And we're mostly looking for sort of technical questions, but in that wide range of like, how do you get started? Like, when do you know you're getting closer? And we're going to be monitoring questions. I'm going to be here a little bit busy next to you, looking for questions as they come in. And I think we had a few already. Where like this is my first AMA. Have you done these a lot?
Never. This is my first too. I heard about Alec Baldwin's AMA at WNYC where we both used to work.
Oh, really?
But I don't know if we should share that here. But it's interesting finding out how these things work. So here we are inside of one.
If you throw anything at any point, I'm here for it. So. Okay, and I'm not. Them a little bit cold. So there's a question, one of our first questions here is about storytelling. How can you sketch an episode outlines and season arcs when sharing about a topic? So, hi, about storytelling. How can you sketch out episode outlines and season arcs when sharing about a topic? Must be, I think, to get maybe like a paper piloting kind of idea, like when you're starting to think about how you might sketch out what your season is going to arc like.
I'm not 100% sure what they mean by when sharing about a topic, but the way we sketch out stories, at least in my experience, is probably the way that you would think to do it. I see actually on the window of the podcast garage over by the door a bunch of sticky notes just stuck on the giant window. And that's kind of what we do, sticky notes, because you can move them, because you can erase them, you can replace them. Just trying to figure out where your story begins, where the middle of your story is, where the end of your story is, and then, as we talk about in the videos actually, figuring out what order you want to tell that story in, because you don't always have to start with the beginning, you don't always have to end at the end. The end could be the first thing you hear, and then you can go back and figure out how you got there, right? So there's linear storytelling, there's non-linear storytelling, but I think running through the best way to tell it might involve telling it to a friend a few times, sketching out different alternatives for the story, and then figuring out what works the best, what makes your friend lean in, what makes them go, this part's kind of boring, that kind of thing. So trial and error, I think, is kind of what we do.
Yeah, I like that low res kind of prototyping where you can sort of put this in front of someone and say, like, yeah, listen for when they dig it, and then they can go deeper, you can reorder things, and then you can get really into the audio. I think as the podcasts are longer, you know, sometimes before you invest a lot of time in that, you know, deep, beautiful mix, you can sort of get some of that first level feedback.
Yeah.
It's really helpful. So.
And I've never turned in a New Yorker story before, but a piece of free advice I got once, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but it was that a New Yorker editor once told like a New Yorker writer, listen, turn in the story in any order you want, just so you know we're going to make it chronological. So like, I guess you could always fall back on, hey, maybe we should just tell this story in the order things happened, because it's a classic structure. It works.
Yeah, it really works. It really is like, I'd say 90% of stories end up in chronological, you know, for kind of good reasons.
People like that.
People like that. They want to know, hey, how did it all begin? So there's a question in here. This is about someone who's been podcasting for a long time and is feeling like they need a mentor, and wondered if you have any advice about finding a good mentor, but without paying for one. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, I can speak from personal experience. I don't know where this person is. Does it say that in the
No,
question?
it doesn't. No.
I mean, I got my start in radio where I got some free mentorship right here in the District of Columbia at a public radio station. Shout outs to WAMU 88.5. I didn't know much about radio. I was very eager and willing to work very hard for zero money, which I know sometimes is controversial, but I was working lots of other jobs at the time, and I wasn't really excited about any of them, but I was really excited about the idea of working in public radio, especially because I really loved public radio and I loved the mission of public radio. And so I kept emailing the news director at WAMU until he eventually said, okay, you can come in. It only took 2 emails, I should say. And it wasn't because I had a great history in journalism or because I had connections. It was just because I showed some tenacity. I showed that I cared. And when I showed up, there was a room full of mentors who, if I showed them that I was eager to work and hungry, they were willing to put in some time with me, say like, okay, let's go for a walk and I'll tell you why that thing you turned in yesterday kind of sucked. And so, I mean, most American cities of a certain scale have a public radio station, and they're often looking for volunteers. So that's a place I would still advise you to maybe look for people who you could start to develop a relationship with.
Yeah.
Is that a good answer? I don't know.
That is a great answer. That's how I got started as well. And right, it's tricky. I mean, I started in community radio, and there's a lot of us, who got started in radio. And nowadays, I mean, there are places like the Podcast Garage.
Right.
A number of places like this are popping up. And the organization, the Association of Independents in Radio, still offers mentorship. And I generally think if you can swing, like even if you can't pay with money, offering some sort of we'll use quid pro quo in a positive sense, so that it's possible to, I think that there are a lot of people out there, and I think once you get established in podcasting, you get a lot of early stage people calling you, and finding a way to kind of give back in that space is probably, it tends to still be a small community, and a very lovely one. One of the reasons I've worked in audio for just a long time is what a great professional community this is. But I would recommend that. I forgot to say at the top, we're going to go until through a half hour, so we're ending at the bottom of the hour at 5:30 here on the East Coast. So I'm going to might run through a couple things. There's a really good question in here about frequency, episode frequency. I feel like this is like one of the most common questions we get is how often should your podcast come out? And do you have a strong opinion of like seasonal production versus sort of regular weekly and bi-weekly production? What do you say to that?
Well, as someone who makes a daily podcast, I would say don't do that. Whatever you do.
Yeah,
but I think it's what makes sense for you. I've seen podcasts over-promise, right? Oh, we're going to come out every week, and then all of a sudden, like after 6 episodes, it's like, oh man, we're going to come out every other week, and then it's like a monthly podcast all of a sudden. What I would say,
when Serial season 2 went from weekly to bi-weekly
Yeah,
production, they were just
even
halfway through, they were like, wait, what?
Even with Ira and Sarah and the incredible team making that show, they overshot it, right? So keep that in mind. Like, what's realistic for your work production schedule, your life, and never launch a podcast with just like 1 episode in the bank. I can tell you that for sure. Make a bunch of them so that maybe you're starting with 10 already done, or maybe you're starting with 5 already done. And in the case of Serial, it's like a developing story, so maybe you don't know how it ends yet. That's okay, but don't just launch with one thing you spent 2 months on and then you have a week to make the 2nd episode. That's going to be hard for you.
Yeah. We add at PRX just a line, generally if you're looking to monetize your podcast, sponsors or people are buying advertising, they like sort of more podcast for vehicle to put their ads in. So we really have sort of consistently recommended, a minimum of bi-weekly, like every other week production. But that is really hard. And actually I say that one of those things you have to decide early on, we say you're going to decide your format, your length, and your frequency. And part of why you should decide those things early is because it sort of backs into how often you can get it out. If you have a really heavily formatted, really narrative, sound-rich piece, it's going to be much harder to produce every other week than, a lot of people are doing chatcasts or just even talking to the microphone, in part because they can do more with frequency there. So you got to kind of tailor your goals, and then I think know who your audience is and what they're going to need. And if you do anything less than regular, I think you have to have some other way to market it because people forget. And sometimes feeds go dead and things like that. So.
And you also don't want to overwhelm people with stuff. we make a 20-minute show every day. I think if we made like an hour-long show every day, no one would want to listen to it because it'd be too much stuff, especially when you think about how much there is out there in the podcasting world, right? So make sure.
Not everyone can be Joe Rogan.
No, I don't know how Joe even does that. But a lot of ads I hear. But listen, like I think it's smart to talk to your audience, to be in a dialogue with them. Even if it's 10 people, hey, like you guys, did you like that thing? Do you want more of it? Do you want it to be shorter, longer? I mean, they're at the end of the day the ones you want to make the show for, as much as you want to make it for yourself too. So find out what people want at all times. I think.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump into kind of a good question. We have a 5-second pause. Oh, that
cool.
That for how fast.
What are the 5-second pauses?
I don't know.
Oh, it's just to fix that.
Yeah, I think it's
technical
delay
stuff.
here. All right, so there's some really good questions here. This is a classic, and it kind of jumps to what I think of as sort of the second half of production, which is reaching that audience. And it's like, what do we recommend to build an audience beyond releasing consistently good episodes and promoting them after the release?
Mm-hmm.
We cover this a lot in the videos. I believe this is episode 8 that we talk a lot about that, and then again in episode 9, which is the money video that you did.
Who can forget?
Right. But if you
check out episode 9, people.
Yeah. If you want to, like, what do you think in terms of this? There's a number of good things that people can do.
And this actually plays into the other question about mentorship, I think. Yeah. I think from like podcasts, small to big. Like, do you remember where Serial launched?
No.
Like This American Life.
Oh, This
right?
American. Oh, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was like,
it's like
I just S-Town, same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's like the biggest podcast in the world launched on another podcast.
Yeah.
And that, I think that model is shared all the way down to the smallest podcast in the world. It really helps to build and establish a community with other people making stuff. And so when you launch your show, maybe you launch it on your friend's show. You make some sort of deal, like, hey, I want to put your show on my show and my show on your show, or hey, could I like help out with your show so that maybe one day when I want to make something, like you could run it on yours. I think, working at Vox, we have a pretty big podcast network. We're constantly doing it. Yesterday's episode of Today Explained was an episode of like a sister show at Vox called The Impact. So I think relying on other people's built-in audiences is the number one way people find out about podcasts, is from other podcasts. So hit up people, get to know people, talk to people, network with people. It turns out there's a lot of people making podcasts out there, so it's actually not that hard.
No, and so along those lines, Kristen Meisner was recently talking at the Podcast Garage in Boston and was saying, that she has pitched herself to other podcasts to be a guest on podcasts, and she does that quite a lot. I'm sure if everyone starts doing this, everyone might get a little bit crazy, but she's so good at it, and she said she pitched like 150 podcasts last year and was on 120 of them. And
incredible.
It's incredible. So that's
her
one
drive.
way.
She was on our show last week.
Yeah, she's remarkable, and she's really smart. She's listening to other podcasts, thinking about how she can be helpful and useful to them. I think most people, once they start a podcast, are looking for content right now, so that could be a really nice way to add it. I mean, we're also, really big fans of live events, having people come and gather and meet each other. And of course, I think if you do have an interview style or guests of any kind, like make sure that they've got everything they need in order to promote the episodes. That's really critical. So giving them links and make sure they've got copy and images and really know everything as soon as possible after you've recorded is great.
And I hate to bring up This American Life for the third time, but whenever people hit me up and they go, I have this incredible story and I want to make a podcast about it, what should I do? My first answer is oftentimes, you should pitch it to This American Life.
Yes.
Because they're always looking for stories, and if you do have a show and you're trying to make something, you might want them to just mention it once on their incredibly huge show, and then like you're set for life. So like think about those things. I think Harry's totally right that there's a lot of existing shows out there that are looking for great stories, and if you have one, you might want to like think about it strategically. Like don't just put it out and like have 7 people listen to it. Think about a bigger show that might want the story, and then we'll talk about your show at the end of the story or something.
Yeah. This is a question I really like, and so it said, I've just started my podcast. The first 2 episodes are out. Congratulations, it's amazing. And I'd love to try some different formats before settling on one. Is that a bad idea? Will people get confused, or is it worth my finding my voice?
I think you can ask 10 people this question and get 10 answers.
Yeah.
I would say, try it.
Yeah.
We try new things on our show all the time. recently we put a laugh track on an episode of ours, and it's a news show, and people did not like it. But for every like 10 people who did like it, one person loved it, and those are the people I cared most about. So I would say give it a shot, but you know, someone might tell you people don't like format changes. What do you think?
Oh, I don't think that there's I think once so there's a different thing about podcasts. People are really coming for you, and people identify a lot with the host.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you do have some latitude to try new things. And I'm a really big fan of trying new things and sort of piloting and testing and things like that. So I think after a while, you know, if you're going to go wild, of course, just make sure you take your listener with you and sort of explain what your thinking is. I think transparency actually works really well. In part, I mean, it always works well, I think, but as a human being. But I think it's also good in your podcast because people will feel very connected to you, and they've joined you for a reason. If you change big topics, that might really lose some listeners. But I think if you change format and are just trying to get better at what you're doing, like, do it. I think that's awesome.
That's good advice.
Okay, let me see. I've got a couple
We
more
didn't
questions.
tell people that they should expect a laugh track in that episode. That probably would have helped.
Yeah, that can help.
You live and you learn.
You live and learn, like you try new things. So, all right. So there's a technical question. I love this kind of question. So, any recommendations for audio equipment when you're starting out? Is it possible to make a few shows without buying mics, or is that an unreasonable expectation?
I would say it depends on the show. If you're doing an interview show, you probably want to have a quiet space and a decent microphone if you want people to listen for an hour to a conversation you're having. If you have a cheap mic that plugs into your computer and you're getting some phone tape from someone and it's brief or something like that, I think that setup could work, but it's really going to depend on what you're trying to make. If you're trying to make a story that you're going to then pitch to a bigger show, you got to be thinking about quality and standards. But if you're making something for yourself and you don't think your audience really cares, they just want to hear you talk and hear a guest who's maybe even on the phone, maybe talking to you through their Bluetooth speaker in their car, like that could work. It really depends.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both came up through public radio where we have very high audio standards, but I would just as a merciful thing for most listeners, I just always make this analogy with my phone, but it's like trying to talk to someone when you're talking into your computer microphone. It feels like it's like this is so far away from you, and generally that sounds like a drag. I think trying to get something that's a little near field, something that might record you more like this even, I would record you like that. And this will actually work. Your other iPhones have very good built-in microphones. You can get inexpensive microphones to try it. So I don't think it's a deal breaker, but like you're saying, it's like you kind of figure out which format you need.
Pro tip though, because we do this all the time with our show, if you're gonna use a phone, ask the person to hold it to their face like they're on a phone call, and you'll get a lot fewer plosives than if you do it like this.
Nice.
You're welcome.
Good one. There was a question, and let's see if I can find it again, because it was also a technical one, so while we're in the mode of this, which is kind of looking for a ratio of how much work per finished podcast, like how long, and this is one of those, just as long as a piece of string kind of answer, because I think, but it's more than you expect. I think that's the other thing, the common thing to say.
I mean, Joe Rogan probably puts as much work as you hear in the episode, and he has the most popular podcast in the world. If you look at the most popular, the second most popular, third most popular, fourth most popular, I think you're gonna see shows like The Daily, and This American Life, where they're putting sometimes days, weeks, months of work into an episode. So I think it really depends on what you're making.
Yeah, and I would say even someone who might do a show that sounds, one thing that's deceptive about podcasting, it's always been a little bit deceptive about radio, except live radio, is that people think that it sounds like a conversation, and it's just people are kind of brilliant right away, and it's actually sometimes a lot of work is going into that, and even if it's just booking the guest, even if it's just figuring out what that guest is supposed to say and preparing for the interview, which we would really recommend, writing your questions in advance, really thinking about the structure, all of that'll take time, let alone what you might then want to do in shaping your audio. And we're always going to recommend, I'm always going to recommend that you edit things down. Nobody talks. I mean, this thing we're doing now, this is live and it's awesome, but I'm sure we could both hear good edits as we're talking that would make it more meaningful for someone who had to tune in later. So, and
to give you a frame of reference, on our show where we do a 20-minute show every day, usually that's half the tape that we got. So if you hear a 10-minute segment, that was probably 20 to 30 minutes of recorded audio. If you hear a 20-minute episode, that was probably 40 minutes to an hour of recorded audio. So I agree that there's always things you can cut, and things are shorter is better, but at the same time, a lot of these chat shows are long. So if you're talking about something super interesting and you've got an audience, they might be game for it, but I would never assume that.
I think the data says that people who listen to a lot of podcasts listen to 5 to 7 podcasts a week, which is great, but I always just think, like, be respectful of their time. Like, shorter is better, and they'll come back if they feel that they've got time to fit you into their life. Like, that's kind of one of my sort of maxims here. So let's see, there's a good question that just came in. Do you have any do's and don'ts surrounding what you put or don't put in your show notes?
Wow, that's a great question, actually. We like to go short and do very little. Like, here's a brief description of the show, and that's it. No links, no nothing. We do links to transcripts, but I've heard a lot from people who do more like niche storytelling, where there's a lot of references in the episode to like this album, this art, this story, this news story, whatever, where they dump links in their show notes, and people love it. So I think that's a great thing to talk to your audience about. Depending on what kind of show you're making.
Right. I agree. That also, I think it's kind of figuring that out and but always have show notes. I think we'll also say that's generally a good thing too. Because I know on my podcast app, I can scroll through and see them. It's very exciting. I think an addition there. All right, so there's a question coming in from someone who's already had a real live TED Talk and a podcasting voice. Which I'm curious about that part. But pitches are not going so great, and there's a new idea, but this person's asking sort of what are some topics that are the majority of audiences are interested in? What do you think of that? That's kind of a really tough one to answer. True crime.
My pal Anna Sale hosts a show called Death, Sex, and Money, and she tells me that the sex episodes always do way better than the death and money episodes. So, I mean, if you look at the top 100 performing episodes on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something like that, and you'll get a sense of what people are interested in. I mean, my buddy launched a Star Trek podcast called The Greatest Generation, where he just talks to his buddy about episodes of Star Trek, and people love it. It's like a whole cult that he built out of an existing cult, which is Star Trek. So, I mean, the things that people are into are the things they want to hear podcasts about. I mean, look how many like podcasts there are about true crime. Wow. So, controversial, but true, right? I mean, there's a show called My Favorite Murder that tours the country just talking about local murders, and people pay them a bunch of money to come out to the shows. It's bananas. So, I mean, I think the things that you're into in life are the things that people want to hear podcasts about, but they're also really interested in the news and, you know, arts and culture, movies, music, all the stuff that you like.
Yeah, I think
That's
that it's very vague. I mean, I think that we spend a lot of time at PRX asking you to really think deeply about who you're making it for. So in some ways, I think that question to me feels it's more like a broadcast model, which is like, what if I just put something out there? Will people find it? And I feel like that push-pull in a creative sense, it's like, I think it's also really helpful if you know who you want to reach, because it's a niche thing, and if you can go find them. So maybe it's going to be true crime, but I think I think actually with podcasting, because it's very intimate, staying close to your area of expertise and lived experience is often very meaningful for people. There are a lot of people making excellent podcasts, like the revolutionary podcasts about their lived experience, and other people find that and want to connect. You know, there's an issue of identity or some other part of their personality or life that is big.
Niches, right? I mean, I just found out there's like a bunch of different Tesla podcasts. Dudes talking about their Teslas, and like some of them are really popular. One of them was called, I was told, The Daily Tesla. There's like a daily Tesla podcast that comes out every single day because people who drive Teslas want to learn more about Teslas. So think about the niche things that you're into, and I think that's a really good default. And the other one is great stories. People love great stories.
Yeah, keep characters. Good. You'll be a character for your listener by default, and then finding other good characters or stories to tell. Here's a great question, because it's about someone who was a semi-finalist for the Google Podcast Creator Program, which I'm sure we told at the time that we had thousands of applications, so you really should, no one who didn't get in should feel like they did anything wrong. This is an extremely hard decision. But this question is sort of about how we've sent some resources and things, but what are some opportunities for getting feedback? And we've talked a little bit about this. Do you have any thoughts about how to get feedback?
I mean, the thing I would go to first is your friends. I mean, they're people you know that like you and want to do you a favor. And feedback, I think, is a favor. It's asking someone to like really think about this thing that you made, right? Which is saying like, give me an hour or 2 hours of your time. So maybe you buy them dinner and say, hey, can I buy you dinner and play you something? Or can I can you come over and I'll cook you dinner and play you something? Something like that is a really great way, I think, to initiate. And take those notes seriously, because a lot of people listen to podcasts right now. So if you hit up your friends who listen to podcasts and they tell you like, hey, I don't think this is very good, think about why that might be. And if you don't like the feedback, go find another friend and see what they think.
It's good to get a couple people. I think also like getting the person you want to reach.
Yeah.
And then we're big fans of giving feedback on what we read this letter like rose, thorn, bud thing, but like getting some like what worked, what didn't, like and what might possibly be. What did I not hear that maybe I wanted to? But I think when you're doing something creative, it can be hard to get feedback, but feedback is the way to get stronger and better. So we're running something, feedback is a gift campaign, which we just ran, and we're going to give like people have a chance to pitch their podcast to us and have to get some feedback, which has been a core component of the Google Podcast Creator Program. We're offering that more and more. So I
feedback is a gift.
Feedback is a gift, even though sometimes it could feel a bit like a punch in the stomach at the same time. So
yeah, I would just say be prepared for that. You know, if the only helpful feedback is going to be critical, thoughtful feedback, and not all of it's ever going to be positive.
Right.
So just be ready for it.
Yeah, you actually don't always want it to always be positive. So, okay. So here's a question, another classic. What time of day is good to drop your weekly podcast? What day and what time of day? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I don't feel expert to offer any assessment there. I know mornings seem to be pretty good from what I've seen and heard. People get up in the morning, they want to download some shows for their commutes and stuff. We put out a show in the afternoon, and that also seems to work for us. I know the weekends, people are like a little shy about the weekends. Like not a lot of shows drop on Sundays, but maybe, try something radical and put it out like Sunday at 11, church time, see what happens.
I came up for one of the shows that we worked with called Preach from KUER in Salt Lake City, which is about young people kind of thinking about religious and spiritual belief. And it's like, oh, would a Sunday drop work?
Yeah.
And I think I think the research says no, but I actually think that you can train your listeners, and their consistency matters most. So I think it's actually one of ththose things that you should, once you start this consistency being like, if you say it comes out on Sundays, have it always come out on Sunday. Don't disappoint your listener like that. They've got a million other things to listen to. There are over 800,000 podcasts out there. So just pick something and stick with it. And then you can be really clear about that. I think it's nice if you make a trailer to include how often we'll come out.
And also keep in mind that though you might put it out Mondays at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, people obviously, that might be when they download it, but people listen to shows when they listen to shows. So we make an afternoon show, but a lot of our listeners tell us that they listen to it the next morning every day. So keep that in mind too, that it may not be dictating when people actually listen, but I think it is important to figure out when you're going to drop and be consistent.
Yeah. So we have just 3 minutes left, so we're going to do like a couple rapid fire kind of things here.
Yes, no questions.
Yeah. Oh well, this one is not going to be yes, no. Sorry, I'm going to think of another one. This is like, what do you do like for music in a space in which you don't want to violate copyright? Any good suggestions?
There are music libraries. One's called APM. We use it all the time on our show. There are very hungry musicians out there. You probably know a few. Ask them if they're interested in sharing some of their music. Maybe it'll be mutually beneficial. But there are a lot, and there's free music libraries online. If you Google free music library, you'll find all sorts of stuff, copyright free. So the internet, but also be very careful that it is copyright free. Sometimes people want to thank you at the end of the show, and I think it's great to be generous with that kind of thing. And sometimes people really want to know, hey, what was that song? People tweet at us all the time, because we don't call out the music in every episode. What was that song that played at 3:44 in the episode on Tuesday? So that's a thing you might want to consider for show notes or for the end credits of the show. Hey, the music came from X.
We got 2 questions. We touched on them both, so you can go quick on these. There's a conversation about books podcast, and they haven't been focusing as much on marketing. So any tips for reaching a wider audience while still being targeted for presumably people who like books?
Go to bookstores. I don't know. Put out some flyers. I don't know how to do that. Do you? I mean,
I would just really be engaged with other bookstores and book readers and trying to figure other places that book lovers are gathering.
Yeah.
And then bringing in, and then if you're talking about specific books, I think trying to piggyback on whatever marketing exists out there about that book might be the right way. So I think social media might be your best bet.
Get in touch with people in the literary world, right? There's a ton of people out there trying to market books, and so if you're making a podcast that's author interviews or something like that, you get in touch with publishers. I constantly get books in the mail from publishers who are trying to sell their books, so it shouldn't be that hard to find these people.
Yeah. We are coming down to our last minute, and actually, what a nice setup. Thank you very much for the audience asking if there are going to be more podcast garages in the other cities. There's a particular shout out here, I think it's for the Bay Area. We love that. We are thinking about this all the time. There are other places that are coming up and saying they want a space like this. I think you should, find that. We're finding a lot of co-working spaces have studios as well. I mean, if we're in your neighborhood, come to us. But if we're not in your neighborhood, then get creative, because I think there are actually places where you can record in a studio, and that can be really nice. I think we're run out of time.
Oh.
We could do this for hours, actually.
In
It's
the
so fun
meantime,
talking
visit
to
the
you.
podcast garages that currently exist. There are two, if you're ever on the East
Thanks, yeah.
Coast, because they're both great.
Yeah, one in Boston and one here in DC. We would really like to welcome you and help you feel connected. We think podcasting can be a lonely business, so actually meeting other podcasters is really helpful, and that's part of what we've done with the Google Podcast Creator Program. We've brought cohorts of people together. We hope these videos that we've made are a terrific resource. They are free. You can share them with whomever. We also have been doing this companion course where people can sign up for emails, and we give you exercises that you can do each week, and a quiz that we've been a little bit goofy, playful with, to reinforce your learning in the video. So please sign up for that. And then we are going to have this feedback as a gift session on January 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern, and watch our social for more details on how to join that as an observer, where we'll talk about how you pitch your podcast and what are some successful things that go into a pitch.
Cool.
But for now, thank you.
Fun. Thanks for coming, everyone. Hi, Matthew. I saw Matthew.
I saw Max said, hey.
Let's say hi.
All right, now I just don't know how to end this thing.
Oh,
So.
let's just stay here forever.
Yeah, let's see. I think, okay, we're good. We just stand here and look nice. Hi, everyone.
Thanks for coming to the garage.
Yeah, it's great to see you all.
To our TED Talk.
My TED